So you're here because you want to get to the heart of what's important, and you want to do it quickly. Think of this as your fast track to really understanding the big picture.
Exactly.
Today, we are diving deep into the major challenges facing India. We're looking at 2024, heading into 2025.
That's right. We've got a pretty comprehensive analysis here. It covers, well, basically everything from the economy, social issues, environmental pressures,
Governance, infrastructure.
demographics, security, yeah, the whole lot. And it's all, connected.
Totally connected. And our mission, really, is to pull out those absolutely critical insights, maybe some surprising facts, and the crucial so what behind it all. We want to skip the noise, give you a clear, hopefully engaging picture. Okay, so let's start unpacking this. India's economy, it's always talked about, this rapid growth, right?
Right.
We're seeing a projection of, 6.3% GDP growth in 2025. That sounds, well, pretty impressive, like a rocket ship.
It does sound impressive, yeah. And that growth figure, it's mainly driven by strong consumer spending, private consumption, and also public investment. That's a big part of it.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Those headline numbers, they don't quite capture the full story. We really need to look at what could potentially impact that long-term stability and development.
Okay, so let's pick behind the curtain then. That 6.3% growth, it's actually a little down from 7.1% in 2024.
It is, yeah.
You mentioned consumers and government spending are driving it.
Yeah.
But the analysis also points to, global economic headwinds, things like trade tensions. How much can those issues happening maybe far away actually affect India?
Well, think of it like this. Even if your own house is in order, if there's a major storm brewing, globally, trade tensions, policy uncertainty elsewhere, it creates ripples.
Right.
It might not be a direct hit, but it can definitely create a drag. Indirectly, even on a strong economy like India's. And, while inflation is expected to ease a bit down to maybe 4.3% in 2025, relying so heavily on people just buying stuff, on consumption, that raises a really key question.
Which is?
Well, can that engine keep running full tilt if the benefits of all this growth aren't really being shared widely?
Okay.
If a big chunk of the population doesn't have enough money to spend, that whole consumption-driven growth model, it just becomes less sustainable over time, like, a car running on only a few cylinders.
That makes a lot of sense. So who is doing the buying? And what about jobs?
Yeah.
The overall unemployment number seems pretty stable, around 4.9%. It doesn't sound too alarming on the surface.
On the surface, no. But when you start digging into who is unemployed, the picture changes quite dramatically. We're seeing really concerningly high unemployment among young people. It's like 29% overall.
29%?
Yeah. And in urban areas, it's 23%. That's almost 1 in 4. And look, for graduates, it's even worse. Nearly 1 in 3 young graduates are jobless.
Oh.
That is a massive amount of potential just sitting idle. And you've got, 12 million young people trying to enter the workforce every single year. The pressure to create enough good jobs is just immense.
Almost a third of graduates unemployed.
Yeah.
That's a huge issue. And it connects directly to India's, much discussed demographic dividend, this massive young population.
Exactly.
But you're saying if they can't find decent work, that huge asset could actually turn into, a burden.
Precisely. Imagine having this enormous potential workforce, but they aren't equipped for the jobs that exist, or the jobs simply aren't there. It's like having a huge army with no training or tools.
Right.
The analysis highlights that only about 46% of graduates are actually considered employable. 46%.
Yeah.
And there are major skill gaps in these booming sectors like AI, renewable energy.
The future jobs.
The future jobs, yeah. And the lack of structural reforms, things like making land easier to acquire or more flexible labor markets, that's really hindered the manufacturing sector, which could potentially absorb a lot of this young workforce.
So it's like having this demographic wave coming, but we're not quite building the surfboard or teaching people how to ride it. Okay, now let's shift slightly. What about poverty? The report does highlight some really significant progress there.
Absolutely. And this is genuinely a success story worth noting. Extreme poverty has plummeted. It went from about 16% down to just over 2%, 2.3% actually, in roughly a decade.
That's incredible.
It is. That's 171 million people lifted out of that extreme hardship level. And multidimensional poverty, which looks at more than just income, that's also seen a really remarkable drop.
Fantastic news. Poverty falling in both rural and urban areas, the gap narrowing, sounds like a clear win. But I remember you used the word paradox earlier.
Yes, the paradox. What's really fascinating and a bit concerning here is that while fewer people are living in extreme poverty, income inequality has actually increased.
Increased. How does that work?
Well, the income Gini coefficient, that's a standard measure. Higher number means more inequality has gone up quite a bit. From 52 back in 2004 to 62 in 2023.
So, okay, more people are escaping the absolute bottom rung, which is vital, obviously.
Crucial.
But the gap between the wealthiest and, well, pretty much everyone else is getting wider. Significantly wider.
That's exactly it. The analysis shows the top 10% of earners now have median incomes roughly 13 times higher than the bottom 10%.
13 times.
So yes, reducing poverty is absolutely essential, but it doesn't automatically create a society where everyone feels they have a fair shot at moving up. And that growing divide, that could sow the seeds for social challenges, maybe even unrest down the road.
It's definitely progress, but with a serious cautionary note attached. Okay, let's move into social development. Gender inequality feels like such a deep-rooted challenge in India.
It really is. And it starts incredibly early. You still see it in the child-sex ratio, which indicates a preference for boys.
Still.
Yeah, and that often translates into girls being disadvantaged from day one, really, in nutrition, healthcare, education opportunities.
And those education numbers, they still tell a pretty stark story, don't they? Female literacy significantly lower than male literacy.
Much lower, yeah. About 70% versus nearly 85%.
Especially in rural areas or among marginalized groups. And the reasons girls drop out, it's things like lack of basic facilities like toilets in schools, early marriage, pressure to do household chores. It's just this web of systemic barriers.
It is a web. And then you follow that through, you see much lower rates of women actually participating in the paid workforce compared to global averages. India's female labor force participation rate was only around 37% in 2023. The global average is closer to 50%.
That's a huge gap.
Huge. And even for women who are working, there's that persistent gender wage gap, women earning about 19% less than men on average. Add to that the reported increase in violence against women.
An increase.
According to the latest Crime Bureau data, And then there's significant health disparities, like very high rates of anemia among women, over half of women, compared to less than a quarter of men, often linked to things like early marriage, which still happens.
Still happens, right?
Yeah.
About 23% before age 18.
Yeah, and limited access to reproductive health care. And even in politics, decision-making roles, women are still heavily underrepresented, only about 15% of the members in the Lok Sabha.
It's just layer upon layer,
Right.
Social, economic, health, political. And the report even touches on the digital world, mentioning increased cyberbullying and online harassment targeting women.
Right. It's another front, unfortunately.
And this isn't just about fairness or social justice, is it? There are massive economic costs to this inequality.
Oh, absolutely huge. Think about it. When basically half your population isn't able to fully participate, contribute their skills, their talents, it's a colossal economic loss. The report actually suggests that achieving greater gender parity could add something like $770 billion to India's GDP by 2025.
$770 billion, just from closing the gender gap.
That's the potential estimated upside. So these underlying societal preferences, like son preference and the way health policies sometimes don't fully account for gender dynamics, they have very real, tangible, negative economic consequences.
So tackling gender inequality isn't just, the right thing to do. It's actually a critical economic imperative for India's future.
Absolutely essential.
Okay. Now let's talk about education more broadly. Access is one piece, but the quality of education seems to be a major concern, especially outside the big cities.
That's right. You look at rural school infrastructure, and it's often just inadequate. We mentioned functional toilets for girls. Only about 56% of schools have them. That directly impacts dropout rates.
56%. That's basic sanitation.
Basic sanitation, safe drinking water, even enough classrooms. Then you have teacher shortages, particularly in the upper secondary grades, which are projected to get worse. Plus, teachers often get burdened with a lot of administrative tasks, taking time away from actual teaching.
And the curriculum itself. The report describes it as pretty outdated, heavily theoretical, not really equipping students with job-ready skills.
Exactly, which links right back to what we were saying about the low employability of graduates, that 46% figure, and the skill gaps in those crucial emerging industries like AI and renewables.
It's a direct connection.
And then you layer on the socioeconomic factors. For families struggling financially, education might unfortunately take a backseat to immediate survival needs. Marginalized communities, people in remote rural areas, they face huge barriers. Even language can be a hurdle, with the dominance of English or Hindi in higher education and certain jobs.
So this lack of quality, accessible education, it really acts as a major bottleneck, doesn't it? It stops India from fully transitioning to a high-skill economy.
Definitely. It fuels that youth unemployment problem we talked about. Yeah. It hinders growth in key sectors like manufacturing and IT, and it limits opportunities for upward mobility for millions. It's a cycle.
A cycle that really needs breaking. Okay, let's turn to healthcare. Access and affordability, another fundamental pillar. We hear about progress, like Ayushman Bharat, but what are the critical pressure points now?
Well, the analysis points to several key challenges. There's the rising burden of chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, cancers. There are still significant regional disparities in where you can get good care.
Right, the postcode lottery.
Yeah, very much so. Climate change is adding new vulnerabilities, impacting health. There's that persistent gap between urban and rural access. And the public health infrastructure, hospitals and clinics, they're often severely strained, under-resourced.
And the funding aspect seems to be a constant struggle. Public health spending is still below the government's own target of 2.5% of GDP, isn't it?
It is. And the recent union budget allocation, while large in absolute terms, actually represented a declining share of the total budget, which is a worrying trend when the needs are so vast. There were calls for things like reducing taxes on health insurance, increasing tax deduction limits. Those haven't been fully met.
So the financial pressure is real. What about digital health? We hear a lot about its potential, things like Isan-Giovanni for remote consultations.
It definitely has huge potential, yes.
Yeah.
Isan-Giovanni is a good example of reaching people remotely, but the big hurdle is still the digital divide.
Wow.
You need good internet access. You need people to be digitally literate to use these services effectively. And that infrastructure, that literacy, it's often lacking precisely in those underserved communities that need it most.
So, potential, but barriers remain. And ultimately, these gaps in healthcare, the access issues, the quality concerns, the disparities, especially for women, like the high anemia rates we mentioned.
Right, 53% of women.
That has a direct impact on the workforce, on human capital, doesn't it? Lower productivity, more absenteeism, bigger economic burdens for families and the country.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected. These social factors, economic factors, they just feed into each other constantly.
Okay, let's move to social justice. The analysis tackles some sensitive but really crucial topics here, starting with the ongoing impact of caste discrimination.
Yes. And it's important to state, despite being legally abolished decades ago, back in 1950, the caste system unfortunately continues to influence social life, who people marry, job opportunities, access to education.
Still pervasive.
It can be, yes. The report notes the very low rate of intercaste marriages, around 5%, as one indicator of its persistence. And the government's recent decision to actually include caste in the census again is a significant step, presumably to get better data to understand and address these lingering inequalities. Discrimination against minorities is also noted as an ongoing concern in 2024.
And then there's this quite worrying mention of eroding human rights and civic freedoms. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report flags this as a top 3 risk for India in 2025.
That's a significant flag, yes. The analysis mentions allegations of abuses, things like torture or extrajudicial killings by security forces, sometimes with impunity, especially in regions under laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act or AFSPA.
Right.
And it also notes concerns about the harassment of journalists and activists, things like arbitrary detention, raids, threats, sometimes using fabricated cases. This has been particularly noted in regions like Kashmir.
And what's the deeper impact of this? How does it affect governance and trust?
Well, what's fascinating and deeply concerning is how this can undermine the very foundations of a stable, inclusive society. When certain groups feel discriminated against, when there's a perceived lack of accountability, it leads to marginalization. It restricts opportunities. It can fuel discontent and social unrest.
It erodes trust.
Exactly. It fundamentally erodes public trust in institutions and weakens the rule of law. And that makes inclusive development much, much harder to achieve. It can even lead to social fragmentation.
It's a stark reminder that, economic growth alone isn't enough. It has to be built on a foundation of social justice, fairness, and respect for fundamental rights.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's pivot now to the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Water supply shortages are flagged as a top-tier risk for India. That sounds incredibly serious.
It is incredibly serious. The WEF report actually identifies it as the most severe environmental risk facing India over the next couple of years, 2025 to 2027, right up there with the most immediate threats overall.
Most severe. Wow. What's driving that?
It's a combination of factors, really. Overexploitation, we're simply using too much groundwater in many areas. Mismanagement of existing resources. Climate change is making rainfall patterns more erratic, worsening droughts, and then there's just insufficient infrastructure for storage and distribution.
And this isn't just an India problem, right? The report mentions it's a growing global concern.
It is. The number of countries identifying water shortages as a top 5 risk has surged dramatically just in the last year, from 7 to 27. So India's situation is acute, but it reflects a much broader global trend.
And the impact goes way beyond just having enough water to drink at home, doesn't it? It hits agriculture, industry.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive multiplier effect. Water scarcity directly impacts food production. Agriculture is hugely water intensive. It disrupts industrial processes. It creates significant public health risks through waterborne diseases or lack of sanitation. And in severe cases, it can even force people to migrate and lead to conflicts over dwindling resources. It touches everything.
A true domino effect. Okay, another major environmental flag is pervasive pollution. We often hear about air pollution in Indian cities, but the report seems to emphasize a broader challenge.
Yes, absolutely. Air pollution is, of course, a huge part of it. It's a massive health risk linked to millions of premature deaths, reduced life expectancy. The report mentions it reducing global average lifespan by about 3.6 years. And it's a huge economic drain.
3.6 years globally.
Yeah.
Staggering.
It is. But the analysis underscores that pollution in all its forms, water pollution, soil contamination, plastic waste, is a critical, top-tier, immediate environmental risk for India. And again, like water scarcity, this is a rising concern globally. More countries are listing pollution as a top 5 risk now.
The report calls it a hidden tax on well-being in the economy. That's a really powerful way to frame it.
It is, because the costs are often indirect but massive. Increased healthcare expenditures, reduced labor productivity because people are sick, premature mortality.
Yeah.
It's a constant drain on resources and potential.
Okay, now what about climate change itself? Interestingly, the WEF report didn't list it in India's top 5 immediate risks for 2025, but we know its impact is being felt.
That's an important nuance. While it might not have ranked in the absolute top 5 for immediate threats in that specific WEF snapshot, the reality on the ground is undeniable. The frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, heat waves, floods, cyclones across India are clearly increasing.
We see it every year now.
Exactly. The data mentioned shows extreme weather occurred on something like 93% of the days between January and September 2024 alone.
93%.
Leading to thousands of deaths, over 3,200 in 2024, and huge economic tolls. And projections show this is only likely to get worse. Plus, rapid urbanization is amplifying the heat island effect. Indian cities are warming almost twice as fast as the national average.
Twice as fast. So even if it's not always the #1 headline risk in a given year, climate change acts like this constant underlying threat multiplier.
Precisely. It makes water scarcity worse, it strains public health systems further, it damages agriculture, it forces displacement. It's this pervasive pressure that constantly undermines development gains and massively increases the costs of adaptation.
Okay. Turning to governance and how effectively India is run. Corruption is highlighted as a significant challenge. That Transparency International ranking, it doesn't paint a great picture.
No, unfortunately not. A score of 38 out of 100 on the Corruption Perceptions Index for 2024 ranked 96th out of 180 countries. That indicates a perception of substantial corruption in the public sector.
And what are seen as the root causes?
The analysis points to a few key things. Excessive regulations and complex administrative systems that create opportunities for demands, opaque bureaucracy where officials have a lot of discretionary power, sometimes a monopoly of government institutions in certain areas, and a lack of really clear, transparent laws and enforcement.
And we hear about funds being siphoned off from social schemes, right? And bribery just to get basic public services.
Yes, sadly. Examples like leakages from MGN Regie or the National Rural Health Mission have been documented. And surveys suggest a high percentage of people, maybe over half, report paying bribes for public services.
And the impact is far-reaching, isn't it? It's not just about money changing hands illegally.
Not at all. It stunts economic growth because it adds costs and uncertainty. It leads to misallocation of investment. Money doesn't go where it's most needed or productive. It causes bureaucratic delays. It erodes public trust massively. It can even diminish the country's credibility internationally. And it has a negative impact on things like education quality if news sources are diverted.
And recent examples like the alleged NEET exam scam in 2024 or other high-level scandals, they just reinforce this perception that it's systemic, not just isolated incidents.
Exactly. It's not just a few bad apples. When it's systemic, it diverts funds meant for welfare, distorts resource allocation, inflates costs for businesses doing things honestly. It has this insidious impact even on education, as you mentioned. It really hinders equitable development, hitting marginalized groups the hardest, erodes that crucial public trust, and can potentially fuel unrest.
A tax on progress itself, as you said, and closely related to this, is the issue of bureaucratic inefficiency. It sounds like some of the administrative machinery is still maybe stuck in a colonial-era mindset.
There's an argument for that, yes. A legacy perhaps overly focused on hierarchy control procedures rather than agility, innovation, and problem-solving.
So what are the key problems identified?
Well, structural rigidity is one. A lack of strong performance-based accountability. The report mentions only about 3% facing proper KPI-based reviews. Excessive red tape, causing those notorious delays, often a slow adoption of modern technology like AI or data analytics, despite initiatives like Digital India, and sometimes frequent political influence that can compromise independent, objective decision-making within the bureaucracy.
And the report suggests some concrete reforms. Things like merit-based appraisals, really pushing digital transformation, decentralizing power.
Yes, exactly. Linking recruitment and appraisals to clear performance indicators, KPIs. Fully embracing e-governance using AI, big data, maybe even blockchain for transparency. Empowering lower levels of government. Seriously cutting red tape, perhaps through single-window clearance systems, and strengthening ethical governance with things like real-time tracking and better whistleblower protection.
It sounds like a pretty significant overhaul is needed to just make things work more efficiently.
It really does, because these inefficiencies, they act as a drag on almost everything the government tries to do. From implementing policies to regulating business, they can undermine even the best-intentioned plans and investments. They slow down critical decisions and approvals. They compromise independence. It's a major bottleneck for economic growth and public service delivery. And again, it erodes trust and limits the government's overall capacity.
Okay, let's shift gears now to infrastructure, particularly the challenges of rapid urbanization and the huge energy demands that come with it. India's cities are just exploding in size.
They really are. The numbers are staggering. Urban population was around 377 million back in 2011. It's projected to hit 590 million by 2030.
Wow.
And potentially another 420 million on top of that by 2050. That creates just unprecedented demand for housing, transport, water, sanitation, all basic infrastructure.
And that has huge environmental implications too, right? Cities are major sources of greenhouse gases.
Huge. Globally, cities contribute about 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and a big chunk of that, maybe 37%, comes just from the built environment buildings, construction. So rapid urbanization strains ecosystems, massively increases energy consumption, and intensifies that urban heat island effect we talked about, with Indian cities warming so much faster.
But the report points out something really interesting here, a kind of opportunity within the challenge.
It does, because so much of the urban infrastructure India will need by, say, 2047 hasn't actually been built yet. Estimates suggest maybe 70% is still to come.
70%, that's most of it.
Exactly. So there's this critical window, this opportunity to build it differently, to integrate climate-conscious development right from the start. Things like low-carbon construction materials, passive design in buildings to reduce energy needs, strong green building standards, sustainable urban planning, integrated public transport.
So it's a real double-edged sword. Managed poorly, this urbanization boom could massively worsen climate change. Managed well, it could be a chance to leapfrog to more sustainable models.
Precisely. It's a absolutely pivotal moment for investment and policy choices with really long-lasting consequences.
Okay. Now, related to all this growth in urbanization is the surging demand for energy, especially electricity.
Absolutely surging. Projections put peak electricity demand at around 273 gigawatts by June 2025.
And the existing grid infrastructure, can it handle that?
That's a major challenge. There are limitations in both capacity and efficiency. The grid needs significant upgrades to handle not just the total load, but the peak load, which is growing fast due to industrial expansion and, frankly, more air conditioning use.
Right. ACs are huge energy consumers. And India has ambitious renewable energy targets, 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030.
Very ambitious, yes. Which is great, but integrating that much renewable energy, which is often intermittent, solar doesn't work at night, wind doesn't blow constantly, creates its own set of challenges for grid stability and flexibility.
You need ways to balance it out. Which brings us to energy storage.
And that's the critical bottleneck right now. There's a huge lack of energy storage capacity. Currently, India has only about 4.7 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage and a tiny amount, maybe 219 megawatt hours of battery storage, BESS.
That sounds small compared to the need.
It's minuscule compared to the target, which is over 60 gigawatts of storage needed by 2030 to effectively integrate those renewables.
60 gigawatts needed, and we have less than 5 now. That's a massive gap.
A massive infrastructure bottleneck. These grid limitations and the storage gap seriously hinder the effective use of all the renewable energy being built. It threatens the transition to climate-friendly industrialization and puts those ambitious 2030 targets at risk. Success really hinges on timely, large-scale investments in grid modernization and building out that storage capacity.
So achieving the green transition goals depends heavily on solving these nuts and bolts infrastructure problems first. Okay, we've touched on demographics quite a bit throughout. Let's focus specifically now on that concept of the demographic dividend.
Right. The idea that having a large population under 35, over 65% of India's population fits this bracket should be this huge economic advantage, a young, potentially dynamic workforce.
It'd be, yeah. But as we've discussed, that potential is being seriously hampered.
It really is. By the widespread youth unemployment, especially among graduates and these critical skill gaps, that figure of only 46% of graduates being readily employable is a major red flag. Deficiencies in skills for key future sectors like AI and renewables, that urban youth unemployment at 23%, graduate unemployment near 29%. And overall, India's workforce is still considered relatively low-skilled, maybe only 20% formally skilled, compared to 80% or more in many developed nations.
And the challenges seem even tougher in rural areas, right?
Yeah.
Getting quality skills training out there.
Much tougher. There's a lack of quality training centers, maybe only 10% are outside urban areas, and they're often underfunded. And significant gender disparities, too. Women make up only about 17% of the formally skilled workforce.
So it looks like the promise of the demographic dividend isn't being fulfilled because the country isn't adequately preparing its young workforce.
That's the core issue. It's squandering a potential economic boost. And worse, it risks creating social and political instability if millions of young people feel they have no prospects. It makes urgent investment in skill development, vocational training, and fundamental education reforms absolutely critical. Otherwise, that dividend could easily turn into a demographic liability.
A ticking clock, in a way. Now, complicating this further are the big regional divides across India.
Yes, this is really significant. The analysis talks about a two Indias phenomenon developing.
Two Indias. How so?
You have the northern states, places like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Jharkhand, generally with higher fertility rates, younger populations. Their working age population will likely plateau later. Then you have the southern states, demographically much closer to East Asian countries, already experiencing lower fertility and facing the challenges of an aging population sooner.
And these demographic differences are mirrored in socioeconomic indicators, too.
They often are, yes. Southern states generally tend to have better literacy rates, better social indicators, health, education access, lower infant mortality, and they currently contribute disproportionately more to the national GDP.
That must create huge challenges for national policy. You can't just apply the same solutions everywhere.
Exactly. A one-size-fits-all approach just won't work effectively. The northern states desperately need investment in education, healthcare, and massive job creation for their young populations. The southern states, meanwhile, face different issues supporting an aging population, potentially dealing with stagnant tax revenues as their workforce shrinks. There's a real risk of exacerbating these regional inequalities if policies aren't tailored.
And that could threaten national cohesion, couldn't it, if disparities widen too much?
It certainly could. It requires really nuanced, decentralized policies that recognize these diverging paths to prevent widening gaps and potential political tensions down the line.
A very complex balancing act. Okay, finally, let's turn to the geopolitical and internal security landscape. Border disputes seem like a constant source of tension for India. The report details a pretty serious recent crisis with Pakistan.
Yes, the events of May 2025, described as Operation Sindoor by India and Pakistan's response, Operation Bunyan and Marsuz, were a stark reminder of just how volatile the situation can be.
Conventional missile strikes, drone warfare, nuclear rhetoric.
All of it. Missile strikes on alleged terrorist infrastructure, Pakistan apparently using drones in retaliation for the first time in this context, leaders exchanging nuclear threats, talk of using nuclear weapons if certain lines were crossed or if water supplies were cut off. India even suspended parts of the Indus Waters Treaty temporarily. It escalated quickly.
And it seems to signal a shift in India's counterterrorism posture. More assertive.
It seems so. A move towards potentially higher-intensity military responses. The 2025 strikes reportedly targeted 9 camps, compared to just 1 in the 2019 Balakot strike. The Prime Minister's statements afterwards suggested a new benchmark, rejecting nuclear blackmail.
A higher risk tolerance, perhaps? And what about relations with China? There was a border agreement mentioned in late 2024. Has that eased tensions?
There appears to have been a diplomatic thaw following that agreement. High-level dialogues resumed, some people-centric initiatives started, but the relationship is still described as fragile.
Fragile because?
Because of the underlying unresolved issues. Lingering border disputes, particularly concerning Arunachal Pradesh. Unresolved disagreements over water resources, especially with China's dam-building plans on shared rivers. And deep-seated economic and security concerns on both sides, even though their economies are quite interconnected.
So a very complex neighborhood, significant risks all around.
Definitely. Heightened intensity in potential regional conflicts, the ever-present danger of miscalculation between nuclear states, especially with new technologies like drones involved. India's potentially lower risk tolerance on terrorism could increase escalation risks. And that stability with China remains precarious. It demands really sophisticated diplomacy alongside robust defense strategies.
And within India's borders, what about internal security threats like Naxalism?
Naxalism, the far-left Maoist insurgency, remains a challenge, although its geographical footprint has shrunk significantly, down from maybe 126 districts affected in 2014 to around 12 by early 2025. But it persists in core areas like the Bastar region.
And the root causes are still there: poverty, inequality.
Largely, yes. The analysis links it clearly to socioeconomic disparities. Poverty, lack of education and healthcare in remote tribal regions, poor governance, corruption. Also, displacement caused by industrial projects or resource extraction, and sometimes allegations of police brutality fuel grievances.
What makes it so difficult to combat?
The difficult terrain in those core areas, challenges in gathering good intelligence, the use of guerrilla tactics, and importantly, those deep-seated historical grievances among parts of the local population.
Is the government's approach changing?
It seems to be moving towards a more comprehensive strategy. The current hold and dominant security approach is set to continue beyond March 2026, possibly until 2027. But there's also an emphasis on engaging local communities through development schemes, and violence levels have dropped significantly, deaths down by maybe 81 to 85% between 2010 and 2024.
So it's seen less as just a law and order problem now.
Increasingly, yes. More as a symptom of those deeper socioeconomic issues, recognizing that military operations alone aren't enough. The shift seems to be towards an integrated strategy that tackles the root causes alongside security operations requiring development, better governance, and security presence.
Right. We have covered a huge amount of ground here, looking at all these challenges: economic, social, environmental, governance, security.
And I think the absolutely crucial takeaway, the thing you really need to grasp, is how interconnected everything is.
Yes.
These aren't separate problems sitting in neat little boxes. They form this complex, interwoven web. Economic growth is tied to inequality and jobs. Social disparities hold back human potential. Environmental issues hit the economy and health. Governance failures block progress everywhere.
Urbanization and energy needs require sustainable solutions. The demographic dividend is at risk.
Yeah.
The security situation is complex. It all loops back.
Exactly. It's a web of dependencies. You can't really fix one without considering the others.
Which really underscores why you need a holistic, integrated policy approach, doesn't it? You can't just use piecemeal solutions for interconnected problems.
Precisely. If India is going to navigate these challenges and build a truly sustainable and inclusive future, the key priorities seem pretty clear from this analysis. It's about fostering inclusive growth that actually lifts everyone up. It's about investing seriously in human capital, health, education, skills. It's pursuing development that is environmentally sustainable. It's ensuring good, effective, clean governance. And it's managing that complex external and internal security landscape with strategic foresight and diplomacy.
So bringing it all together then, India clearly has immense potential. But realizing that potential really hinges on its ability to tackle these formidable interconnected challenges head on and hopefully turn them into opportunities for positive transformation.
Well said.
So for you listening, think about this. Of all these connections we've discussed today, the economy and inequality, environment and health, governance and everything else, which single interconnectedness do you think is the most critical hinge point for India's future path? And what kind of integrated solution might make the biggest difference? It's definitely a lot to think about, and we hope this deep dive encourages you to explore these crucial issues further on your own. Thanks for joining us.